Hi, everybody. Let's begin. My name is David Brown. I'm a professor of political science, and I'm the divisional dean of the social sciences here in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Colorado. And I'd like to welcome you to the first installment of a series of webinars this academic year from the Social Science Division. I'll also mention that our good friends in the Conference on World Affairs are also sponsoring this throughout this particular panel and the ones throughout the series. For future webinars, the theme is going to be on race and inequality, which will involve subjects like social justice, the environment, income inequality, and political inequality. If you have an issue that you'd like us to discuss, or you have an idea for a panel, go ahead and email me at dsbrown@colorado.edu, and we'll see if we can make it happen. This webinar is entitled Electoral Distancing, U.S. Elections in a Pandemic. The goal of this panel is to learn as much as we can about the electoral process and the challenging issues that we're going to face as we cast our ballots on November 3rd. Let me introduce sort of some of the themes that we can talk about as just sort of prompts for this hour. One is just the history of the process. I'm going to ask the panelists to give context, sort of a political science 101 whenever they can when they're talking about a particular issue. I think we should also touch on the difference between what's going on in Colorado and what's going on in the rest of the states. We have a fairly unique situation here in Colorado. And then one of the things we'll start with is the national popular vote in Proposition 113, which is something that we're considering here in Colorado. We can talk about the security of the vote, how to hack. I don't think any of us are black hat hackers or anything like that, but we can talk about some of the vulnerabilities of the vote. And then finally, if we haven't touched it on already, towards the end, I'm going to ask the panelists to talk a little bit about scenarios they think might happen. I'm not asking them to predict what will happen, but they can choose a scenario that will that might happen and how we would proceed through that. So without further ado, let me introduce the panelists. First, we have Ken Bickers. He's the chair of political science. And one of the projects that he's working on is entitled Local Government Elections Project. And so this is a look at the recruitment and elections at the local and state level. And in particular, he's looking at how partisan elections or term limits affect the outcomes there. So we're very lucky to have Ken here as a panelist. Next, we have John Griffin. You may know him as the Conference on World Affairs Director. Sort of undergirding his research is political inequality in American institutions. He's written a number of books and articles on a number of different issues having to do with that. And if you look at some of his later articles, I wrote down a couple of questions that I found intriguing. One, I actually wrote down several days ago before there was any mention of tax returns. And the question he was asking were, do Americans care how much congressional candidates make? So we're happy to have him on this panel. I'm sure he can add quite a bit. Next, we have Professor Jennifer Wallach. She's a professor of political science, and she has a brand new book out by Oxford University Press called Compromise in an Age of Party Polarization. Now, I never thought I'd say this about Jenny, but she may be the most optimistic on this panel, given what she finds in her book, in the sense that people do cue on politicians and their process of compromise and sometimes trade that off for holding ideological positions. So again, she's an expert on political behavior, political psychology. So someone that would be very helpful to have on this panel. And last but not least, we have Anand Soki. He's the director of the Keller Center. The Keller Center deals with First Amendment issues. So conferences and talks on First Amendment rights, academic freedom, freedom of expression, those sorts of things are things that his group is looking at. And so I would take a look at the political science website, look for the Keller Center. There's a lot of things going on this year. He has a new book called Politics on Display, Yard Signs, there it is, and Politicization of the Social Spaces. And so that's looking at yard signs. Why do people put them in their yards? And what effect does that have on your neighborhood potlucks. So with that said, let's get on to the format. What I'd like to do is simply lead off with questions that have already been submitted, and I'll let the different panelists address each one of these to sort of give us a flavor of what what tack they want to take with this question. And then what I'm going to do is open it up to Q&A. You can see at the bottom of your screen, there is an icon called Q&A. And so the way we're operating is if you can type in there a question that you have that you want the panelists to talk about, put that in there and we'll try to get to all of them. I'm sure we're not going to be able to given the size of the audience here, but nonetheless, we'll do our very best. So anyway, that'll be the format. Let's start off with, there's actually two questions that I'm going to sort of mold together. One comes from John Worrell, and I'll just read it out for the panelists. Can you guys please comment on the Electoral College debate that is happening now? Joining or not joining the push for a national popular vote seems to be relevant these days. So we're sort of going to dive right in and open up the can of worms in terms of an Electoral College, that sort of thing. But related to that is a question that comes from Erin Fish, who's asking, she's curious about campaigning and how the Electoral College affects either the Trump or Biden campaigns. She notes that being in California, we rarely see any kind of commercials other than on social media. I would assume Colorado is a state where both campaigns are spending money on ads and grassroots efforts. So with that said, I will let the panel take it away from here and answer your questions. Ken, would you like to start us off with that first question about, talking about where are we at with the debate on the Electoral College? What are sort of the issues? If you can kind of get us kicked off, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So the issue, for those of you not in Colorado, there's a ballot measure that we'll be voting on here in Colorado, Proposition 113, which would add Colorado by voter initiative to the National Popular Vote Compact, which is a group of states that pledge that if enough states with enough Electoral College votes, 270, join the compact, that all of the electors from those states would vote for whoever wins the popular vote nationally. So it would be a plurality vote, not a majority vote, a decision rule. So whoever wins more votes of the candidates that are running in that cycle, those states would pledge to shift all of their electors to that candidate. It's basically a workaround the constitutional amendment process, and would shift the United States from the Electoral College. It would still exist the form of it would still exist, but the substantive impact would disappear. It would be a national plurality vote that would determine which presidential candidate gets the most electors, and it would be the majority required to put that person into office. So it's a very innovative kind of idea. There have been some arguments that it might be unconstitutional. There is a clause in the Constitution that requires that Congress approve any compact among the states to be effective. The courts for well over 100 years have narrowed that clause so that it's only required if it changes some law or behavior in the states outside of the states that are agreeing to it. So my own guess, and it's just a guess, is that this the National Popular Vote Compact would not fail due to the compact clause, because the courts, including a court decision just a few months ago, have said the states can determine, as specified in the Constitution, how they want their electors to vote. And in fact, the old issue of unfaithful electors has now been eliminated. The states can require that the electors vote in the way that the state legislature, or in this case, the citizens acting as a whole, would determine. That's kind of what's the change. The principled arguments, I won't go into them too much, but the framers of the Constitution wanted a system that protected voice in small states. The debate over the Electoral College was a debate over the impact of large states versus small states. And the Electoral College, which was one of the very last compromises in the framing of the Constitution, was designed to provide some protection for small states, to make sure that they continue to have a voice in the selection of the president. So this would move away from that in a fairly dramatic way, because it would mean that the large population states would get all of the attention. Right now, the way it works, and this kind of segues into the second part of the question, the one from Aaron about strategies. Right now, because there are states that are very lopsided, California, New York, Texas, although this year it's a little closer maybe. But they're big states that are lopsided on partisan grounds. There's not much campaigning that goes on in those states. Most of the campaigning takes place in states that could go either way in the presidential vote, the so-called battleground states. The battleground states tend to shift from election cycle to election cycle. So if you want to see commercials, if you live in a non-battleground state, just go online and watch television on your computer from Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Ohio, North Carolina, Florida. You'll get lots of ads. This will cure any insomnia that you may be suffering from. So you can have that experience, but that experience is really largely focused on the so-called battleground states, which typically is about 8 to 12 states, usually somewhere in that ballpark. And again, they typically will be somewhat different states. It used to be that California was a battleground until 1996 was the last year that it kind of ended as a battleground, but it was before that. So I'll stop there, but that's kind of an overview of that national popular vote compact issue.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Let me turn the question over to John, and let me ask it in a way where we can think about the system that we're in now and the system that's being proposed with the national vote, and in terms of inequities or inequalities, that sort of thing, since that's something that John works on, and I'm curious to find out as well that, and what does this mean for representation? I think that's key on everybody's mind. Oftentimes it's as Ken mentioned, there's the idea of small states versus big states, rural states versus more urban states. What's your perspective on that, John?
Thanks, David. Let me first react to a couple things that Ken mentioned and build on that a little bit, and then I'll get to your question.
Sure.
Before I wrap up, but remind me if I don't get to it. So the first point I wanted to make is that the purpose of the Electoral College was to create a barrier between citizens' votes and the election of the president. And so what many people don't maybe fully know about or appreciate is that someday in December, after the election is over, there are some people that go to the office of the governor in Colorado, and those 9 people cast Colorado's 9 electoral votes. And nothing in the Constitution requires all of those people to cast their votes for the winner of the popular vote in the state of Colorado. Colorado decides that, okay? And that's called unit rule. And it happens to be that 48 out of the 50 states have adopted unit rule. And that is why we end up with a scenario where sometimes the Electoral College winner is not the national popular vote winner. So that is something that is not constitutionally prescribed. It is a matter of states' individual determinations as to how to allocate their votes. And Maine and Nebraska don't do that. And in fact, Colorado rejected a proposition or initiative to allocate its electoral votes proportionally back in 1994, I think it was, or 2004. Anyway, some time ago. So, so point number one is that the Electoral College was an expression of the fact that sometimes citizens might want to elect someone who could be a tyrant, and we want to have a safeguard in between citizens and the election of the president. related point is that the bias that's then created in the Constitution is really just the fact that every state gets 2 electoral votes based on its senators, and some states have much larger populations than others. And so there is a small state bias in the Electoral College, but it's limited just to that. It's the fact that every state gets 2 electoral votes regardless of its population. So a third point then is that, to agree with Ken in a way, Prop 113 in Colorado, or this as part of a larger national compact, is a workaround, but it's a workaround that states are unable to or unwilling to cooperate to simultaneously change the allocation of the way that they cast their electoral votes. If states could, if they could agree to state by state, move away from unit rule and the mass allocation of their electoral votes in the way that Colorado tried to do whenever that was, then the national compact would be unnecessary. So that's kind of a bundle of things, but point number one, all having to do with the fact that the Electoral College does not require states to allocate all of their votes together. The second point I want to make is something I talk with my students about all the time is if I ask the students, if we had a national popular vote in 2000, who would have won the election? Or if we had a national popular vote in 2016, who would have won the election? And some students, maybe reacting too quickly, say, well, in 2016, Hillary Clinton would have won the election. And in one way, that's true. But in one way, you have to appreciate the election campaigns would have been run completely differently if we used a different set of electoral rules. And it very well could have resulted in the same outcome. In other words, we have a set of rules that the candidates play by, and they adapt their strategies, kind of to Ken's point about what states they focus on based on the rules that they're given. And if you change the rules, you can't, it could result in a different outcome, or it could lead to the same outcome. It'd be like saying the Denver Nuggets would have beaten the LA Lakers if there was no 3-point line or something like that. Well, would they have taken all the same shots if there was no 3-point line? We have no idea. So anyway, second point is that the parties campaign according to the rules that they're given. And if we change the rules, they will campaign differently. Two points. One more point, and I'll get to your question, David, is I do think that what we'll see differently this time in terms of the campaign strategies, given the rules aren't changing, is that I think that there's some indication that the Clinton campaign tried to run up the score in 2016, thinking that it was going to win, and kind of took its eye off some states that were swing states and tried to go after states that maybe it could have won and gotten a larger national mandate, or perhaps win a few more Senate seats. My sense is that this time there's not that sense of confidence in the Biden campaign. And then to get to your point finally, David, and I'm sorry to have delayed in getting to it for so long, I think it's really interesting to think about how moving to a national popular vote would affect the parties' coalitions, right? So imagine we move to a national popular vote and that one of the parties, doesn't matter which one, is disadvantaged by that move, okay? Because basically in the nation at large, there's fewer people that support that party. Well, they're not going to just sit there and do nothing. They're going to go try to get some more people to join their coalition. And so, for example, let's just say, for example, that nationally that there are somewhat fewer number of Republicans than Democrats. And well, the Republican Party is going to go say, well, how can we get some more voters? So they might substantially revise their coalition. For example, they could say, well, we want to form a coalition of lower income voters, regardless of race, regardless of religion, regardless of geography. We want as many lower income voters as we can find, or they could do the opposite. But what that, under that scenario, what it would produce, I think, is an interesting new era in American politics of class divide, because American politics the parties typically have not been divided by class in the way that they have been in some other parts of the world. And so there are, in other words, wealthy, middle income, and poor people in both of the parties. And if we move to a national popular vote, it could be that the parties might coalesce around economic issues much more cohesively, which could be very, very divisive, actually. But it would certainly lead to a very different conversation nationally around questions of redistribution, inequality of income, and so forth. So that's my first instinct, or I think would be an interesting potential change if we move to a national popular vote.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We'll get back to the whole rules changing behavior and vice versa in a little bit. But let me now go to Anand and ask about how you think if we went to the national popular vote, do you foresee, and this is sort of getting in the same spirit of John's answer, in the sense that there are things that'll change. It's not like we put a new institution in place and everything is solidified. People will adapt. And so what I want to know is whether or not changing to that national popular vote would have an impact on the way people participate. So I don't know if I can't tie a direct line to yard signs, but I know there is one there. But how will it affect people's behavior in terms of participation? Is there an unforeseen spillover effect if something like that is tried?
Yeah. So let me just start by saying that thanks for having us, David. And I agree with everything my colleagues have said so far. To add on to those comments by Ken and John, and to elaborate and address your point, I would say a couple of things come to mind. One is that we have the kind of, in terms of thinking about kind of bottom-up dynamics and civic engagement, we like to say that every vote counts, right? And then we know that campaigns are not treating elections as presidential elections as every vote counts. To exactly what Ken and John have kind of described about with the dynamics of the Electoral College, some states are getting the attention and some states aren't, right? So, but if you change to a national popular vote, then the numbers game shakes out differently. And so if you think about the micro level kind of story there about how a voter might approach that and the things that people say to each other about why you should participate, there's probably a more compelling argument for those people who've been ignored and have been in places that haven't been, competitive and have been, have not had a lot of campaign attention, to get out there and vote, right? Because your vote is it's a number, right? But it matters now in a way that it was diluted through the Electoral College previously. And so from there is that side of it from a civic engagement perspective, and it will change the way that campaigns and voluntary organizations interface to try to mobilize people in places that they probably haven't spent as many resources before trying to mobilize. So, those are certainly things that I could see being, possible outcomes of such a change. One thing to mention, and I know that our audience is interested in this, and that my colleagues and I have had conversations about this. It always comes to the questions about the potential for abuse of the system and fraud too. And one thing I think to mention, since we were you asked us to kind of, as we go, give the 1101, the intro US Gov kind of discussion about these different aspects of this, it's really important to remind our audience that election administration is extremely decentralized in the United States, right? So it varies across the states, and then within states, it varies quite a bit by counties in terms of how professionalized they are. So if you look at like Front Range counties and the resources and infrastructure they have in place versus, let's say, Western Slope counties in Colorado, you see differences, right? And think about that all over the country. And so how elections happen and how people interface with elections is something that's absolutely worth paying attention to. And if suddenly we care about every vote in every state, that's going to change the way that we think about election administration and resources. It is also going to, one might argue in terms of being concerned about fraud. There's been arguments that I've seen that I think are somewhat compelling, right, about reasons to not go to the popular vote because of the potential for just candidates only trying to run up the vote in highly populated areas, highly dense areas. That would also, in terms of targeted fraud efforts, right? So the argument goes, just getting it out there, make them, highly valuable or selective targets for interference efforts. When you have this dilution that we currently have, and you have things that are kind of spread out, and you have all of these different entry points into the system in states and counties, then it's harder to have a coordinated fraud effort, right? So that's an argument that people have made. I leave it to people as to whether they buy it or not. But those are just some of the different things that we would want to think about if we move to a popular vote in terms of how it would change things from the bottom up, how it would change things in terms of infrastructure and election administration, and then what some of those concerns might be about fraud and abuse.
Thank you, Juan. Jenny, you've been very patient. I want to ask you about, this sort of gets back to Aaron's question. How have you seen advertisements and campaigns change in the battleground states? And what sorts of things are you picking up on?
Yeah, we have a tradition, as others have noted, of having this winner states and loser states in terms of who gets to see all the fun campaign ads that get you excited for the campaign and interested in following candidates. It's actually what inspired my dissertation research back in the day, as I was living in a state with no ads, and I felt like I was being deprived of a presidential election a little bit, to not be kind of getting tons of ads and mailers. And it's kind of the fun of the experience if you're into politics. And we still see that in the election this year. The battlegrounds are different than they were in 2016. If we're looking at ad spending over the past month or so, Arizona is a battleground. Pennsylvania is one again. North Carolina is seeing a decent amount of ad spending. Florida is a battleground this year. Wisconsin's hanging in there. Probably Ohio will surge in the next month. Michigan less so. But what's interesting is that there's a big disparity in kind of how they're allocating ad dollars in this election. So far, Biden is significantly outspending Donald Trump in his campaign advertising on television. But there's been a big shift toward digital ads. And that's where, if you're living in California, you're more likely to be seeing those kinds of ads this election. Digital ads are sort of an unknown quantity. They haven't been studied as much. In 2016, Donald Trump actually just had a kind of enterprising director of web advertising who just tried a bunch of different things randomly and was fairly successful. Like most people look at the web advertising campaign of Donald Trump and think that on the whole it was successful. But it's still a learning ground, and it's kind of interesting to see how the candidates are approaching it this year. You'll see that right now, Donald Trump is outspending Biden in terms of web advertising, but the gap seems to be closing in recent weeks. What we're seeing is that the states where web advertising are common are not the same states that are getting the television advertising. And that's an interesting sort of challenge to the traditional battleground dynamic. So battlegrounds are places where you're trying to shift the undecided voters, to persuade people to waver from their favorability toward the incumbent or to question their partisan choices. The web advertising is being concentrated in states like California and Texas, which are not going to be most likely competitive battleground states in the election. Florida's in that list too, but and that's probably more likely to be a battleground. But it's partly because this web advertising seems to be targeted more towards getting people to donate money and rallying partisan activists toward their fidelity toward the cause. And that's kind of a shift in campaign strategy towards, historically, we've often used campaigns as a tool of persuasion to try to get the undecided voters to shift their preferences and take sides. And this kind of web advertising seems to kind of have a different strategy toward mobilizing the base, getting partisans to get involved by donating money.
So Jenny, I've got a question for the panelists and attendees from Nick Wild, and it's relevant to what you were just saying. Is there, well, I'll just ask the question. He asked, is there a saturation point with ads and ad spending above which it ceases to be any more effective? Is there any, what's the research on that?
I don't know of anyone who's shown that. There's definitely always been a worry that people don't like negative ads. Like if you ask people in surveys whether they like them, they don't. Most Americans don't admit to liking them, but there's also this wisdom that they're effective. They capture your attention, they're memorable. Like if you've seen negative ads this year, you can probably describe what they're about. And how many ads that you've seen this year can you do that of? Like, what did you see in your last Taco Bell commercial? No one knows. But the political ads are memorable in that way, and because they're so emotional, they're so evocative, they're so vivid. So I think people would like to think there's a saturation point, but I don't think we have any evidence that really suggests that that's the case. There's sometimes worries that there might be a punishment for running too many negative ads. It might be that you're perceived as negative, but I think that's a contested sort of finding in the literature. There
has been some work on low information voters, low receptivity voters, so it's frustrating for people that are higher receptivity, higher information voters that are paying more attention. But the argument in that literature is that there's some people who pay very little attention to politics, but they are the most receptive to persuasion. So the challenge is you've got to really saturate them at a level that no one else wants in order to just get their attention, but they have a higher probability of shifting their vote based on information if they get the information, but they're not getting the information. So part of this oversaturation is that last small percentage of voters, and I would guess that absolutely everybody on this webinar is not in this category because you're on this webinar. So this is for people that are not only are they not here, it would never even occur to them to tune into this. And so the advertising that becomes you just want to explode because it doesn't quit. This argument, this hypothesis is that the advertisement is working for this last small and shrinking population of voters because they are persuadable if you can get their attention. And so this sheer repetition and trying different kinds of ads and so forth is trying to get to those voters. And in a close election, and we've had close elections, this is likely to be a close election. You can understand why the campaigns don't want to leave those voters on the table and not try, particularly when they've got lots of resources, to go ahead and keep advertising to try to get those last few persuadable voters, get their attention and get them to move.
Excellent. Well, let's change the subject a little bit and talk about sort of the enviable position that Colorado is in, where I'll get my mail, I'll fill out the ballot. I have to go all of 2 or 3 blocks to drop it in a box. Not all the other states have that. I guess there are a couple of questions here, and I'll just sort of throw it out for anyone who wants to talk about it. There's been a lot of discussions about whether or not you have to request a mail-in ballot or whether or not it's sent to you. There is a brouhaha when the Postal Service wanted to send out some information about asking for a ballot, but it didn't pertain to all the different states. And the Secretary of State of Colorado was suing the Postmaster General or the USPS. There's that's going on. So what can you, and I also know that the process of Colorado going to a mail-in system, this just didn't happen overnight. And it was something that, systems were in place. So I was wondering if you could talk about, any of you want to volunteer, talk about the mechanics of what the system looks like here in Colorado and the difficulty or relative ease that states will have in dealing with the mail-in demand, because of the COVID situation that we find ourselves in.
I could take this if you want, or others, I'm happy to defer. Well, let me just say that there are three types of states on this. So there are states that you have to request an absentee ballot. And that was the norm. And every state has a mechanism for requesting absentee ballots. And so there is that. Colorado moved several years ago on a county by county basis. It wasn't statewide, to using mail-in ballots. And so basically the mechanism was to replace the reason for an absentee ballot, where you didn't have to give a reason and everybody was sent a ballot in the mail. And so that was the way in which it was accomplished, when some of the early counties, and they were largely front range counties that could experiment, they had the resources to do this and do it well. And they had to work out some of the mechanisms for signatures. And Colorado has a fairly conservative version of this, which is that the ballots have to be received by election day, or no later than the official election day, in order to count. So unless some judge changes that, which is entirely possible this election cycle, the way it's been working is that the ballot has to be received. It can be dropped off or it can arrive in the mail. But if you send it too late for it to arrive by election day, it is not going to get counted in Colorado. Some of the states that are quickly moving to mail ballots are just requiring that the ballots be postmarked by election day, which means that they can dribble in for a long time after the election day. And that's, I think, going to be a problem. So the third set are these the states that are newly adopting the mail-in ballots, and they haven't had a chance to work out the mechanisms. One of the mechanisms in Colorado is that the election judges see every signature. So both the Democratic and Republican judges at the counties are looking at every signature and the signature that shows up on the back of the envelope on the ballot, so that there is a confirmation process. It's quick, and it's certainly open to things slipping through. They get 1 second to look at each of those signatures, which is not a long time. That's a lot of ballots flashing by, that's 60 every minute. And I don't know how long I could focus on that, but that there is a mechanism for that. They are not machine compared. They are compared by eyes. But these other states that are quickly instituting this statewide, they are not, they haven't had time to invest the resources, the infrastructure, and all of that kind of stuff. And so it's entirely conceivable that there will be lots and lots of challenges to the votes by both sides, depending on who's advantaged by the initial count. The Democrats will challenge, the Republicans will challenge. I think that's less likely here in Colorado, because the state has had a long time now to get used to this system and to work it out in every county. And the small counties still have some problems with this, that on the eastern slope, eastern plains and the western slope in particular, but the state has had a lot more time to get used to it.
Anyone want to add? Or yeah, Jenny.
Yeah, the mail-in ballots are really fascinating because they're both full of promise and peril. Like, I think it's easy to think, Ken does a nice job of highlighting some of the fears about, when voters have to do something differently, it's hard. There's a lot of voters who are uncertain about exactly what mail-in ballot looks like for them, how to do the process, and that's always going to be a threat to turnout. There's worries about the administration of it getting counted. But the promise of it is really interesting too. Like, it's been really phenomenal, the impact of mail-in ballots in Colorado. Like, we can't say some of the stuff decisively because the state's changing too, just as mail-in ballots have changed the state. But the turnout has skyrocketed in Colorado. In 2018, we had record level of turnout. It was 63% of eligible voters in Colorado voted in the 2018 midterms, which put us second to only Minnesota. And Minnesota's always loved voting so much. And that we got there so fast from being kind of a middle turnout state probably has something to do with mail-in ballots. And those studies of mail-in ballots also suggest that they're changing the demographics of the electorate in interesting ways. Like, those marginal voters, people who have less voting history, less voting familiarity, less kind of ingrained civic duty, whether that's lower socioeconomic status, minority voters, and young people, those are the ones seeing the biggest boost in turnout as a result of mail-in ballots. The primaries in 2020 also had more voters participate than any time in the state's history. And so mail-in ballots have a lot of potential to really increase the share of the electorate who's participating in elections in meaningful ways.
I love that Jenny mentioned that. And I jokingly have referred to this to some student questions as Colorado's kind of answer to not having like mainline Protestant, kind of civic duty kind of history, like Jenny mentioned with like Minnesota. And that's absolutely right, that the turnout has skyrocketed. And to some of the questions you posed initially, David, when you register, you will be sent a ballot automatically if you were registered, and there are different mechanisms for registration, including automatic registration through the Bureau of Motor Vehicles in Colorado. One thing that our viewers should know about this election, there's a link on the Secretary of State's website where you can check your registration status in Colorado, for those of you who are connected to Colorado and trying to vote in Colorado. And you can register to vote up through election day. If you register to vote within 8 days of the election, you will not be able to get a mail ballot sent to you. You'll have to actually go get a ballot or vote in person. But so there are some caveats there in terms of how it actually works.
And you've seen the process unfold in Colorado. Have you seen any change in terms of, so there's more participation, but have you seen any change in terms how people vote, if they vote for one sort of thing versus another? Because I know that one of the things you do on the side is run a survey for the American Political Research Lab. And I'm just wondering if you see anything in terms of going to the mail-in ballot having any impact on the actual substance of how people are voting or not.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, David. And so just a kind of quick, kind of teaser to our audience, we will be asking a question, hopefully in a survey that goes into the field in a couple of weeks of a statewide sample of Coloradans about things like the national popular vote measure and a number of other issues. So we may have at least a provisional answer for you about how it's looking, with a certain amount of uncertainty attached to it, of course. But just wanted to mention that. Yeah, if you look at the state, I think a couple of things to remember. I get asked a lot, as I'm sure that Jenny, Ken, and John do too, about whether Colorado is blue. And I would say yes, right? And certainly if you look at recent elections, so it kind of depends on how you're looking at things. And so if you look at self-identified partisanship in a number of the surveys we've done recently, this kind of Democrats have a bit of an advantage. But if you look at registration numbers, you see that unaffiliated voters are the plurality in Colorado, and then the registered Democrats and Republicans are about 30-30. So in terms of, you asked kind of if it's changing how people are voting, it's certainly changing the fact that more people are voting, right? We're seeing, and the state is changing as well. In terms of like the background kind of characteristics, it depends a little bit in terms of how you consider, how you want to think about this, whether you think about self-identified partisanship, whether you think about the registration that people have. And then one other thing to kind of answer your point and give a little bit of additional context is, one thing that people do worry about with mail voting is the potential for people making more mistakes. So we could call these maybe residual votes. People talk about these in different ways, but overvoting or undervoting on a ballot. When people are voting in person, when these things are done, with in-person computer setups, oftentimes there's a flashing error message that'll help somebody correct a ballot. Not always. These things vary quite a bit by county and state in terms of what election administration looks like. But when you have a mail ballot, right, there's nobody to correct your ballot, right, in the same way, no mechanism in the same way. So people do worry about the potential for mistakes with mail-in ballots, and that's why you see some some instructions on the ballots that people get in Colorado, for example, about what to do if you make a mistake and how to handle it. And one other quick thing I'd mention about mail balloting in Colorado, there's variance at the county level in terms of what things like the envelopes say. So if you look at the recent primary election and those envelopes that your ballots were delivered in, for those of you who voted in the primaries, you saw messaging on the front of them in some counties that said, return your ballot as soon as possible. And not all counties may have said that, right? And a quick kind of reach out to the Secretary of State's office and looking around a little bit, we discovered that the messaging varies by county level administration. It can. And so there's a lot of unanswered questions about this process, as Jenny has alluded to, about different things here, about what these effects might be. Are we if we are encouraging people to return these ballots more quickly, what does that do? And frankly, also, I'll mention this and then I'll cede the floor. It definitely changes the nature of campaigns when the ballots are sent out, let's say roughly October 15th, and you have a non-trivial number of people that have already voted. That late October surprise means something very different if, let's say, 25% of the ballots have been cast. So exactly what this process does for the nature of how campaigns work and what traditional campaign dynamics mean is something that we're frankly still sorting out.
So we're changing to a September surprise is what you're saying to some degree.
You could think about it that way, I think, yeah, in terms of moving timelines up. And there are normative issues involved in that theorists would debate too, like that simultaneity should be an important part of democratic process. That takes simultaneity away, right, from the voting experience with mail-in balloting, because people are making decisions at different points with different amounts of information depending on when they do it. Anyway, it's something to think about.
So let's move on. I see we've got about 13 minutes or so. So let's get to what we'll get to the area that I'll call the Bill Maher question, or it's related to that, and it's if President Trump loses, will he leave office? That's something one of the audience members asked. But let me sort of couch it in a different way. And I want to turn to John for his expertise in for U.S. Congress. So I think I heard out of the corner of my ear the other day, or I saw in the corner of my eye, that Speaker Pelosi is starting to have discussions with Congress about what to do if things go wrong. And so I just wanted, John, to hear what your perspective is. You could give us a political science 1101 question in terms of how things will work if things are in dispute, or why Congress would deal with the election, when they would step in, and what are the things that we need to look for along those lines.
Congress in the Constitution, Article 1, has has power over electoral rules. States, as Ken was saying, are expressly given the power to choose the time, place, and manner of electing representatives and senators. But Congress has also expressly in the Constitution the power to make or amend state laws regarding elections. So in other words, congressional laws can preempt state laws. So if you'll permit me just briefly, as this, for example, would pertain to the conversation around mail-in voting, Colorado's experience with mail-in voting, which, as my colleagues were saying, has been largely positive, might suggest that, or some might say, well, why don't we move to a national mail-in procedure? And I would be maybe a little bit reluctant to do that too quickly. As I think Anand and Ken were both saying, is to get the mail-in process right is pretty nuanced and sophisticated, and Colorado has had some time to implement that. We know that that for example in North Carolina, where maybe their procedures weren't quite as far along. There was an instance of ballot harvesting. This is where someone goes door to door and collects people's ballots for them, sometimes even fills them out for them. So anyway, so, you know, to your question about the integrity or the honoring the electoral outcome, I guess my 2 cents is, and maybe I'll come back around to the congressional power in a moment, but is that I think you're referencing the president's comments about leaving office peacefully. I think my sense is that this president oftentimes is fairly loose with his language, and that he was not threatening to call in the military or anything like that to refuse to leave office, but rather was saying, you know, if the outcome's in dispute, I'm going to fight it, you know, and I think that, I hope that's what he was articulating, because that has happened before. That happened in 2000 when the outcome was in dispute and both of the parties fought it legally. So I guess where I would come out on the question of congressional power is I think it's much more likely that if the electoral outcome is not clear immediately, that there will be a legal dispute over the outcome, fought out on a state-by-state basis. That seems to me to be the more likely sort of disputatious outcome of the election, rather than some sort of congressional intervention or something like that. So.
Thank you. Well, so we've got about 8 minutes left. Let me, we'll do another sort of round robin here for everyone. And I'll ask a similar question in terms of, again, I'm not asking necessarily for any prognostications, so our forecasts are all off the hook in regards to that. But tell me, what are the things that you're looking for over the next month where you're saying, okay, things are going, they're going to be okay, and it looks like things will run pretty smoothly. And then also, what is the outcome that, and I'm not talking about partisan outcome, I'm just talking about the integrity of the electoral system. Where do you think the weak point is, and what will you be looking for to see if that's in fact going to be come to fruition, shall we say? So I'll open it up to anyone who wants to take that first.
I'll go.
Yeah, go ahead, Jenny.
I think one of the things I'm watching with great interest leading up to the 2020 election is just the outrageous enthusiasm of the electorate. It's really remarkable if you look at polling of this election compared to past elections. One common question we ask is about vote intention. How certain are you that you'll participate in the election this fall? And a survey from the Washington Post and University of Maryland put this number at 78% of Americans said that they felt absolutely certain that they were going to vote this fall. The average over the last 10 elections was 66%, and never has been above 70% in the history since going back to 1984. So it's clear that voters are really animated by this election and really engaged, even though it's under difficult circumstances of a national pandemic. I think the thing to watch out for is that voters are also anxious about the election in a way that's not quite true in past elections. Generally speaking, most Americans remain confident that their personal vote will be counted, but there are rising concerns about voter fraud. It's on partisan lines. So Republicans are worried about mail-in ballots. Democrats are worried about Russian interference. People have different fault lines about their sort of worries there. If that lingers, that's not great for the democratic system. To the degree to which people doubt the ability of elections to reflect the will of the electorate, that's not a good thing. Anand raised earlier that maybe, we don't need to worry about fraud very much. And studies from political scientists generally find very little evidence of individual level voter fraud. But to the degree to which people worry about politicians being unfair and outside interference, that's potentially worrisome for the long-term history of elections.
Yeah, John, did you want to follow on that?
Yeah, I think my worry is builds right on Jenny's great points, which is I worry that it doesn't really matter how much fraud there is or how much Russian interference there is. It's the perception of fraud or the perception of interference that is critical. And what concerns me is candidates of either side calling into question the legitimacy of the outcome or how we arrived at it. Because I think with both the current president and the previous president, it has become customary to say, this is not my president, and among both, alternating parties. And I would like for us to get to a place where we have an election and where there aren't seeds sown as to the legitimacy of that outcome. And so no one, regardless of whether they disagree with the president and his or her policies, would say, this is not my president because I don't think this person was, legitimate, or there's some doubt in their mind as to whether that's the case. So, yeah,
Ken, and then I'll go to Anand.
Yeah, so I'll tell you what I'm watching and looking to see, partly because it's geeky and I like to do it and it's fun. I like to look at the undecided, the percentage of people who are still undecided or not answering questions on the various polls. If you only go on the basis of people that are announcing whether they're going to vote for Trump or Biden, the election's basically over. Biden is up nationally. He's up by a reasonable amount in the battleground states. I don't think anybody really believes that, and that's because people are thinking that there might be shy Trump voters that are not answering the surveys, or that there's still some people out there that really haven't decided. So even though at one level this looks like it did in 2016, where people said this is over, the probability of Hillary Clinton is so high that there really isn't, much of an interesting contest at this point. But as Jenny said, the enthusiasm is high, the anxiety is high. People are treating this like there's still a real choice. So for me, what I'm looking at is where are these people who are currently undecided or they're unwilling to say how they're going to vote? What's happening to that size? Because as long as it's bigger than the margin of the people that are declaring, then it could go either way. And so the debate tonight, it or the other debates could shift that. Usually there's correlation in where the undecided folks go, and it may go to Biden, it may go to President Trump. So I'll say that. The other is, if we get a decisive election, it makes all of these other issues kind of go away.
Yeah,
if it's close, that's where the disputes in the courts are going to come from.
And we got 1 minute.
I'll just add to what other people have said, that what I worry about most is the perception of fraud, the legitimacy of the election in the electorate's eyes and the public's eyes. If you look at the numbers, like the Brookings Institute put out a report, and they were actually working with data from the Heritage Foundation, so crossing ideological boundaries here. But you basically saw 8 cases of fraud between 2005 and 2018 in Colorado out of nearly 16 million ballots cast in general elections. So fraud is really, by most, and that those numbers are the same across other states that have been studied. 1 in a million, right? Literally. But it's the perception that really matters. And so that's, disconcerting in the sense of, when you have candidates that are making public statements that are saying that the election is preemptively rigged and stuff like that. That is not good for the health of the democratic system. Those are some of the things that I worry most about.
I think we can all agree on that. Well, listen, I want to thank the panelists. I also want to thank everyone who stayed with us. We actually had a fantastic crowd that hung in there the whole hour, and I got all sorts of nice comments about how things proceeded. So again, I want to thank everyone, and I also want to make the announcement in terms of, keep your eye out on other webinars coming in the future, partnering with CWA and the social sciences. So again, I just want to thank everyone and have a nice afternoon and enjoy the debates tonight.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye now.
Good to see you all.
All right, thanks.
See you guys.